In this lecture, we are going to study about preemptive and non-preemptive scheduling. So preemptive and non-preemptive scheduling are two different ways in which scheduling can take place. Now remember that preemptive and non-preemptive scheduling are not CPU scheduling algorithms, but there are two ways in which CPU scheduling takes place. So in this picture, we will try to understand what this means, and we will try to get a good idea about preemptive and non-preemptive scheduling. But before we move ahead into this topic, there are two other important terms that we need to first know about. So let us see what they are. So the first one is CPU scheduler. So we have been talking about CPU scheduling from the previous few lectures, and we need to understand what a CPU scheduler is. So by now, we must already have a brief idea of what scheduling actually is. So what is a CPU scheduler? So it says here, when the CPU becomes idle, the operating system must select one of the processes in the ready queue to be executed. The selection process is carried out by the short-term scheduler or CPU scheduler. The scheduler selects a process from the processes in the memory that are ready to execute and allocates the CPU to that process. So from the name itself, we can understand that CPU scheduler is the one who is going to select the process that will get the CPU for its execution. So we know that scheduling means assigning the CPU to different processes for their execution. So there may be many processes that are ready to be executed and are waiting to just get the CPU. Among those ready processes, the CPU scheduler is the one who will select which process will get the CPU in order to do its execution. So what you will do, it will select a process from the processes in the memory that are ready to execute, and it will allocate the CPU to that process. So that is a function of the CPU scheduler. So similarly, there is another thing that we need to know about, and let's see what that is. So the second thing that we need to know about is the dispatcher now. What is this dispatcher? And what does it do? The dispatcher is the module that gives control of the CPU to the process selected by the short-term schedule. So what is dispatcher does is that it will give the control of the CPU to the process that was selected by the CPU scheduler. So we see that there are different number of processes waiting in memory to be executed. They are ready to be executed. That means they're ready to get the CPU. So what the CPU scheduler does, it will select one of the process and say that yes, you are the one that is going to get the CPU to begin your execution. And what is a dispatcher? Dispatcher is a module that actually gives control of the CPU to that process that was selected by the CPU scheduler. So we need to understand that this dispatcher has to be very quick, because there are a lot of process switching that is taking place. So we know that there are different processes waiting for the CPU, and when one process is executing, and when it goes into a waiting state, we need to give the CPU to another process. So this happens very frequently, and thus switching between this processes must happen very quickly. So the dispatcher has to be very quick. And so the time it takes for the dispatcher to stop one process and start another running is known as the dispatch latency. So here is another term that we need to know about. Dispatch latency. That is the time that the dispatcher takes for stopping one process and starting another one. That means the time it takes for the dispatcher to switch the CPU between two processes. That is what we mean by dispatch agency. So we can know that in order to have an efficient computation, we need to have minimal dispatch latency. All right, now, since we have learned about these two terms, CPU schedule and dispatcher, now let us go ahead and look into preemptive and non-preemptive scheduling. So in order to understand preemptive and non-preemptive scheduling, we need to know that CPU scheduling decisions may take place under the following four circumstances. So we will see what are the circumstances, and we will see what do we mean by this CPU scheduling decisions that we are talking about. So let us see what are the four circumstances that we have, and let us see how the CPU scheduling take place in this four circumstances. And from that, let us see how we can understand the concept of preemptive and non-preemptive scheduling. So coming to the first circumstance, it is when a process switches from the running state to the waiting state. So CPU scheduling decision may take place when a process switches from running state to the waiting state. So what do we mean by running state and waiting state? So a process has already begun its execution. That means a process is already in hold of the CPU. At that time, we said that the process is in running state. And then what is a waiting state? We have already discussed the previous lecture. When the process is waiting for some operations or something like that to be complete. At that time, we said that the process is in waiting state. So at that time, it is not making use of the CPU. So you need to have a good understanding about the defense states in which a process can be. In this lecture series, I have already done a lecture about the different process states, where I have explained in detail about the states in which a process can be, and how a process switches from one state to another. So if you have not watched that lecture, I highly recommend you to watch that lecture so that you will understand the different states that we are talking about in this lecture here. So I will leave a link in the description for that lecture if you have not watched, so that you can watch it. So coming back, we see that the first circumstances when a process switches from running state to waiting state. So at this time, a CPU scheduling decision may take place. All right, let's go to the next point. So the next circumstances when a process switches from the running state to the radio state. For example, when you interrupt a course. So we already know what a running state is. When a process is using the CPU and undergoing execution, it is in running state. And for example, when an interrupt occurs, at that time, the process will have to hold its execution. So it has not completed its execution, but due to some interrupts, it can hold its execution. Now when it is holding its execution, remember that the process execution has not yet completed. It still needs the CPU to complete its execution. So after the halt is complete, the process again goes back to the ready state. That means it is again ready to get the CPU to continue its execution. So that is what we mean by the ready state. When a process is switching from a running state to the ready state, at that time, also CPU scheduling decisions may take place. So moving ahead, we are going to understand what do we mean by this decisions for now. Let us just focus on this circumstances. So let's come to the third one. So the third circumstance is when a process switches from the waiting state to the ready state. For example, at the completion of our input-output request. So here we already know what a waiting state is. When does a process go into a waiting state? A process goes into a waiting state when it had some audio request to be complete. So we have already discussed that when we studied about the CPU burst and I/O burst in the previous lecture. So when a process is waiting for some I/O to be complete, it is in a waiting state. And once the I/O request has been completed, it has to continue its execution. So what will happen? The process will again go to the ready state. That means it is ready to continue its execution and wants the CPU to continue its execution. So this is another circumstance. And even at this circumstance, a CPU scheduling decision may take place. Now let's go to the final point. So the final point is when a process terminates. So this is very straightforward and easy to understand. When a process has terminated, then the CPU has to be assigned to some other process. So a CPU scheduling can also take place at this circumstance. Now let us see what is a CPU scheduling decision that we were talking about in this 4 circumstances. So here it says, for situations 1 and 4, there is no choice in terms of scheduling. A new process, if one exists in the RDD, must be selected for execution. However, there is a choice for situations 2 and 3. So let us try to understand what this means. It says here, for situations 1 and 4, there is no choice in terms of scheduling. And why is that? Let us see, let us closely observe situations 1 and 4. So, in situation number 1, the process is going from a running state to a waiting state. That means it was running, and then it came to the waiting state, where it is waiting for some I/O operations or something like that. So in the previous lecture, when we started studying about scheduling itself, we said that why we are having this scheduling is when a process is waiting for some I/O request or something like that to be complete. We don't want the CPU to remain idle. We want the CPU to be utilized by some other process at that time so that we can maximize our CPU utilization. So that is why when a process is in waiting state, we have to make sure that another process gets the CPU and utilize a CPU. So in this point number 1, when a process switches from running state to the waiting state, we have to assign the CPU to some other process for sure, so we have no choice here. We have to assign the CPU to some other process, because their current process is waiting all right. So we see that in point number 1, there is no choice. And in point number 4 or it is very easy to understand there is no choice. Because when a process terminates, then the CPU is freed by that process, and then the CPU has to be assigned to some other process. So this is very easy to understand. So in point number 4, also there is no choice. So in situation 1 and 4 there are no choices in terms of scheduling. So what should we do? A new process, if one exists, in the RADIC must be selected for execution. So in the radio if there are processes available, we have to select one, and they must be given for execution. But however, there is a choice for situations 2 and 3. So it says that our choices for situations 2 and 3. So let us closely observe situations 2 and 3 and try to understand what is the choice that it is talking about. Let's see situation number 2. When a process switches from the running state to the ready state. For example, when interrupt occurs, so if you closely observe, at this point, we see that the process did not go to a waiting state, nor has it completed its execution. That means it is not in a waiting state, and also it has not determinated. So when does this happen? This usually happens when an interrupt occurs. So a process was running, and it was in hold of the CPU, and then while it was running, some interrupt occurred, and due to that, it had to hold its execution. It did not go into waiting state because it is not waiting for any operations for itself. But what will happen? It will hold its execution and go to the ready state because it says that whenever the CPU is available, I am ready to execute. So it goes from the running state to the ready state. Now here, what is the choice that we have? So here the choice that we have is that once the process goes from a running state to the ready state, then we see that at this moment, that process has lost control over the CPU. So the next phase, who should get the CPU? Whether the same process that was executing will be given the CPU or some other process will be given the CPU. So this is the choice that we're talking about here. Even though the process has not completed its execution, since it went to the ready state due to some interrupt, the moment the CPU available again, will the CPU be given to this same process, or will it be given to some other process? So that is the choice that we have in this situation number 2. Now let's look at situation number 3. So here it says, when a process switches from the waiting state to the ready state, for example, at the completion of an I/O. So here what happens? The process was in waiting state. That means it was already running and it had some I/O operations to complete. So it went to the waiting state. Now when the I/O operation has finally completed, then the process comes back from the waiting state to the ready state. That means now it is ready to be executed. So even at this time, we have a choice that we can make because the CPU now available and whether to give the CPU to this process that we talking about, or should we give the CPU to some other process. So this is also a choice that we can have in this situation number 3. So with that, I hope you understood the choices that we can make in terms of CPU scheduling decisions according to the circumstances that we have. Now, since we understood all this, we are in a position to define and understand the meaning of preemptive and non-preemptive scheduling. So, when scheduling takes place only under circumstance 1 and 4, we say that the scheduling scheme is non-preemptive or cooperative. Otherwise, it is preemptive. So let us try to break the sentence down and try to understand what it means. So when scheduling takes place only under circumstance 1 and 4, it is said to be a non-preemptive or cooperative scheduling. And why is that? That is because the CPU is assigned to some other process only when a process has either terminated or it has gone to a waiting state. So when a process is in the running state, the CPU is never taken away from it. So when a process is running, it will not be disturbed. It will be allowed to use the CPU until its execution is complete. This allows to hold the CPU until and unless its execution is complete. So the CPU will be taken away from it once it has terminated or if it has gone to a waiting state. Only in these 2 scenarios the CPU will be taken away from it. That is why it is called non-preemptive or cooperative. But in situations 2 and 3, we say that it is preemptive. And why is that? That is because we see that here the processes were still running and we're ready to be executed. But instead of giving the CPU to that same process, the CPU can also be given to some other process. So we see that the CPU can be taken away from a process even while it is running. So here we see that it was in a running state. In number 2, it was not in a waiting state, nor has it completed, but it was in a running state, and it went to the ready state. And why it was? Because of some interrupt. So the process was still running, and then it went to the ready state, and at this point, the CPU could be given to some other process. So we call it a preemptive scheduling because before it has completed, the CPU is taken away from it. And even point in number 3, we see that it was in a waiting state, and then it went to the ready state. That means it was ready to be executed. And keep in mind that this was already a running process, which came to a waiting state, then to the ready state. Here also we can give the CPU to some other process instead of giving it to this same process. So we see that the CPU is taken from it before its execution was completed. So here also, it is a preemptive scheduling. So we see that in preemptive scheduling, the basic idea is that the CPU can be taken away from a process even before it has completed its execution, or even before it is going into a waiting state. So that is what we mean by preemptive scheduling. And in non-preemptive scheduling, the CPU will never be taken away from a process until and unless it has either completed its execution or it has gone to a waiting state. So that is what we mean by non-preemptive or cooperative scheduling. So if we compare these two types of scheduling, we will need these two types of scheduling for different scenarios. We cannot say one is better than the other. We may need both of them according to the different scenarios that we have, and different operating systems follow different kind of scheduling. It may be preemptive or non-preemptive. We may think that non-preemptive is a good way because a process will not be disturbed until and unless it is complete, or until unless it goes to a waiting state. But there may be scenarios where when a process is being executed, there is a very high priority process that has to be executed. So at that time, we may need to stop the execution of the one and give the CPU to that process of higher priority. So at that time, preemptive scheduling will be required, but also preemptive scheduling comes with a course. Now why do I say that? That is because there are different scenarios, and one example that I will give is about shared memory. So let's say that a shared region of memory to which different process has access, and different processes can write or read from that shared region of memory. So let's say that we are following this preemptive scheduling, and one process was writing something into that shared region of memory. So another process came, and then the first process had to be preempted. That means the first process was halted, and then the CPU was given to the second process. Now the second process, when it reads from that memory into which the first process was just writing and did not complete what it was writing, so that second process is to read some inconsistent data because the first process that was doing the writing job did not complete what it was doing. So those are some of the problems that we can face. But as I said, we cannot say one is better than the other. We may need both of these types of scheduling depending upon the situations that we have. So with that, I hope the concept of preemptive and non-preemptive scheduling were clear to you. So these two concepts are very important when we study about serious scheduling algorithms or any other topic related to scheduling. So I hope this was clear and helpful to you. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next one.